Dr. Avi Loeb, welcome to my podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I am so excited about this. I reached out a number of months ago because I'd read an article about you in New York Post, maybe? I'm not sure.
Yes, the New York Post started this storm of media storm, I would call it. Another one. And the Vera Rubin Observatory is a new observatory that will come online within less than 3 years. And it could potentially find one every month. And my point is that if we deploy cameras within the orbit of the Earth around the sun, one of the cameras may be close to a future Oumuamua-like object, and it could take a picture, a photograph. And, you know, they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book. I wouldn't need to write the book if we had a picture. And that's really what I want.
Okay. I've got one more question about it being melted. Could it have possibly been some sort of object that was melted in a different solar system and then somehow parked, and then our solar system ran into it? Or am I misunderstanding things? If you're talking about are you talking about a natural origin? Yeah, I'm trying to pick holes in your astrophysics theory.
So let me help you in doing that.
Okay.
So I wrote this paper suggesting an artificial origin, and the scientific community then divides into three parts. There is a small contingency of people that are, bloggers and popular science writers, and they don't really practice science. They don't have a single paper over the past decade that they wrote. And I don't really care what they say, that is of no interest because they are not practicing scientists, Then you have the vast majority of the astronomy community. These are people that never worked on related subjects, and they just prefer not to get into controversial debates. So they say, it's probably a rock, it's probably natural, business as usual. But then you have the people I really respect, the scientists that pay attention to the anomalies, to the unusual properties of Oumuamua, and try to explain them as a natural object. And they suggested the following. One proposal was that maybe it's a hydrogen iceberg, sort of a chunk of frozen hydrogen, so that when it evaporates as a result of the illumination by the sunlight, there is a cometary tail that gives it this push as a result of the rocket effect, but we can't see the hydrogen cometary tail because it's transparent. The problem with that is hydrogen and a hydrogen iceberg can very easily get evaporated. So we wrote a paper showing that it would not survive the journey. Such an object could not really travel across large interstellar distances. It would be evaporated by starlight. Then there was another proposal that maybe it's a cloud of dust, just like a dust bunny that you find at home, the size of a football field. Okay. And the dust particles are very loosely bound, so it's very porous, and it's 100 times less dense than air. And then by reflecting sunlight, it's so lightweight, it's sort of a fluffy cloud of dust that it gets pushed by reflecting sunlight. And the problem with that is just what you suggested. When it gets along the path of Oumuamua, when it gets closer to the sun, it gets heated by hundreds of degrees. And I find it hard to believe that such a cloud of dust that is 100 times less dense than air would have enough material strength to hold together if it's heated by hundreds of degrees. And then there was another suggestion. Maybe it's a shrapnel, a piece, debris from the disruption of a bigger object by a star. When an object comes close to a star, just like you were suggesting, maybe it melts it, maybe it produces by the force of gravity, the gravitational tide makes some shrapnel pieces. The problem is that this would produce usually elongated pieces rather than pancake-shaped pieces. And moreover, the chance of coming close to a star is very small. Most objects will be far from a star, would not suffer that. And why would you get the first object to be a relic of that? So anyway, there are problems with all three proposals that were put on the table. That's all. These are the three alternatives that were suggested. And you just put them, side by side on the table, and next to them, the artificial origin. And to me, it looked more compelling. Okay, the artificial origin. Now, you might say, okay, it's a matter of taste. Fine. I have arguments against those three, and I doubt that they are the explanation. But my point is, let's collect more evidence. And the reaction of the community is, it's never aliens. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. To which I say, extraordinary conservatism leads to extraordinary ignorance. Because if you reject upfront the artificial origin possibility, you will never what do they want? That I bring them an alien that will shake their hand and only then they would be able to discuss the subject? That makes no sense. We have some anomalies, we need to explain them, and we put all possibilities that we can think of on the table and then collect more evidence. What else? And if we just assume it's a rock, we will never collect the evidence. It will resemble just like a caveman. A caveman presented with a cell phone would conclude the cell phone is a shiny rock, because that's what the caveman is used to doing. So my point is, we have to collect more evidence. We have to take it seriously. And in my book, I talk about Oumuamua's wager, similar to Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, said, about God. He said, there are two possibilities. Either God exists or not. And if God exists, the implications are huge. So we must contemplate that possibility, discuss it, because the implications are huge. I say the same thing about Oumuamua being an artificial object. The implications are huge for us. So we cannot dismiss, we cannot brush it off. We should collect more evidence.
Yeah, 100%. Wasn't germ theory, wasn't that dismissed before there was evidence? And that had huge implications too, not recognizing the germs were
right.
real.
No, there are many examples in history, and I guess the most important among them is the idea that we are not at the center of the universe. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle argued we are at the center of the universe. Of course, it flatters our ego to believe that, and for 1,000 years, people believe that. And he had a beautiful model where there were spheres centered around us. And then Copernicus and Galileo Galilei argued, no, the Earth is moving around the sun. And what was the response to that? The philosophers at the time said, we don't want to look through your telescope. We know the answer. The sun moves around the Earth. And they put Galileo in house arrest. Now, what did they accomplish? They maintained their ignorance. And, the Earth continued to move around the sun. So reality really doesn't care whether we ignore it. It's whatever it is. And just think about the bigger picture. Imagine that we have relics of ancient civilizations that, may be dead by now, billions of years ago sent spacecrafts or other things into space. And now these things are passing near us. And just look at Earth from above and think, all these scientists are not even willing to entertain that possibility. And therefore they're saying everything is rocks, and they're ridiculing Avi that is just suggesting to check. And, does that make any sense? I don't think so. Why should that, why shouldn't we check? The implications are huge for our perception of our place in the universe.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I don't want to be unprepared when aliens show up.
Exactly.
Everyone goes, oh, you weren't a rock. Too late. But wouldn't you? My assumption for if there's any type of alien out there, my assumption would be that if they end up coming to Earth, it's probably not out of a place of curiosity necessarily, and more of a, oh, this seems like a habitable place and you guys are kind of annoying. So if we end up with more evidence that there's some sort of alien tech, what do you think the proper response to that is? Is it, what do we do?
Well, that's an excellent question. So let me first say that most of the junk we'll find in space is very old, probably, billions of years, because the sun is a late comer. Most of the stars formed before the sun, billions of years before the sun. And so if they had a history similar to us, there were civilizations that existed billions of years ago, and by now they're dead. They're not around anymore. So, it's sort of like on Earth, there were cultures that are not around anymore, like the Mayan culture. We cannot have a phone conversation with the Mayans. They're not around. The only thing we can do is find relics that they left behind in archaeological sites. And in the past, we searched for civilizations looking for radio signals. but that's equivalent to trying to have a phone conversation. You need the counterpart to be alive. And if most civilizations are dead by now, that's not a good approach. So my suggestion is simple. Let's do space archaeology. Let's look for relics floating in space. And of course, it's just like getting a letter in the mail. If the post service is very slow, the person who sent it is not alive anymore. And that's okay, because you learn about the past history and you can learn much more. And Oumuamua may be one of these relics. And I think space archaeology should be a mainstream activity, something that we do just like archaeology on Earth, in order to find about previous cultures that may have existed.
That's smart, of course. There should be way more evidence of things in the past than there is of evidence right now.
But to answer your other question, you asked me what would be the proper response if there is a contact with a live civilization. And to that, I would just say, when you enter a room full of strangers, it's prudent not to speak first, just to listen, because you never know what risks might be awaiting. As you were pointing out, maybe there are some malicious intentions out there that could harm us. And so unfortunately, we were not careful. We were not very intelligent. We were broadcasting for more than a century now, radio waves into space and announcing our existence. And if there is anyone out there within 100 light years with a radio telescope,
who's making these decisions for the rest of us?
Now, it will take a while for them to respond, of course, because of the distances, but we will probably hear back at some point.
That's horrifying.
It's horrifying. I agree.
I definitely did not sign up for that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So we're putting blinders in the form of taboos on the scientific community. And you brought up a really interesting point here. And that point is that the alternative explanations to explain the anomalies of Oumuamua are all theoretical objects. So in a space artifact would be a theoretical object. So would a hydrogen, what did you say? A hydrogen iceberg or a dust bunny. So it's okay in the scientific community to postulate theoretical objects as long as they are not alien technology or an artifact of an alien civilization.
That's exactly the thing. You touched on it. And why would there be a taboo? Okay, so then we get to the question, and the one possibility is because of the science fiction literature and because of UFO reports, and the scientists want to distance themselves from those discussions. But my point is, if you go back to the Dark Ages and people were saying you shouldn't dissect the human body, that you shouldn't have an operation because the human body has some magical powers and there is a soul. Imagine if scientists would say, oh, there are all these ridiculous statements being made about the human body. We don't want to discuss it because of the literature. I mean, where would modern medicine be today? I mean, science must address, especially a question that is of public interest. The public is extremely interested. The public is funding science. We have an obligation, not only to attend to the public interest, but to pursue this question because it would have a huge impact on society. I call that Oumuamua's wager in my book. Because the consequences would be so great, we need to put the resources to explore this question.
Right. And so your other point about extraordinary theories require extraordinary evidence, the fact that we're not putting the energy, because of the taboo, we're not putting the time, energy, money into this research. So there's really no way to come to that evidence as long as we're not putting the time, money, and energy into it.
Exactly. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You basically say, I need extraordinary evidence, but then you don't allow for that to happen, and you will never see it. So it's just like the philosophers in Galileo's days that said, we don't want to look through your telescope. We know that the earth, that the sun moves around the earth, and they put him in house arrest. The point is that didn't change reality. Reality doesn't care whether we ignore it, and the earth continued to move around the sun. So we can bury our head in the sand, and not look out. And in principle, we might think that we are the smartest kid on the block, just like my daughters thought that they are the smartest kid on the block when they grew up at home. But when they went out to see other kids in the block, they realized that this might not be true. And unfortunately, if we don't look for wonderful things, we will never discover them. And to me, just figuring out who is in my neighborhood is the fundamental aspect of my existence. I just want to know how many kids live in my neighborhood and whether they're smarter than I am, because I can learn from them. That's the very least I can do, or I can learn from their mistakes.